There are different levels of assurance. The primary levels are reasonable assurance and limited assurance. Understanding the differences between these two types of assurance is imperative, as these concepts are pervasive throughout your study of this subject. There are three primary differences between reasonable assurance engagements and limited assurance engagements. The first relates to the level of assurance that is provided by each engagement. The second relates to the work effort involved in the performance of the different engagements. And the third relates to the type of opinion that is provided in the written assurance report. Let's start by using a continuum to plot where reasonable and limited assurance engagements would sit in relation to each other. On one end of the continuum, we have no assurance provided. For example, where the practitioner is asked to compile financial statements for the client, there is no opinion provided by the practitioner, but simply a set of financial statements. On the extreme opposite end of the continuum, we have absolute assurance provided. Absolute assurance basically means that the practitioner is 100% certain. It refers to a situation where every single item has been tested. In other words, the practitioner did not test on a sample basis, but rather tested everything. This type of engagement is extremely rare, as it is costly and time-consuming. For example, consider an engagement where the practitioner is required to provide an opinion relating to the existence of vehicles owned by the client. If there are only 12 vehicles in the fixed asset register and all vehicles are easily accessible, then the practitioner is likely to test all 12 rather than choose a sample. In this case, the practitioner would be providing absolute assurance relating to the existence of the vehicles. Limited assurance engagements is a low form of assurance. However, it is still an assurance engagement. That is, an opinion is provided by the practitioner relating to the subject matter, and users would be able to get some comfort over the correctness of the subject matter based on the opinion provided, albeit to a limited extent. A common example of a limited assurance engagement is a review engagement. Reasonable assurance engagements provide a high level of assurance. These engagements are closer to absolute assurance, but do not provide absolute assurance, since the practitioner tests item on a sample basis, then projects the results of the sample over the rest of the population. A common example of a reasonable assurance engagement is audit of financial statements. The work effort required for a reasonable assurance engagement and a limited assurance engagement is the second major difference between these two types of engagements. In a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to obtain an understanding of the entity and the business by making general inquiries. The practitioner will also perform basic analytical procedures. These analytical procedures are not substantive in nature and do not generally require the practitioner to obtain corroborative evidence. In a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner will also be required to obtain an understanding of the entity and the business by making general inquiries. The practitioner will also perform analytical procedures, but unlike in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner will be required to perform both basic as well as substantive analytical procedures. For example, in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner would rely primarily on inquiry, whereas in a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner would be required to seek corroborative evidence. In other words, where basic comparative analytical procedures would suffice in a limited assurance engagement, a reasonable assurance engagement would require detailed predictive analytical procedures that can be referenced to corroborative evidence. That is, everything needs to be proven and referenced back to evidence that must form part of the engagement file. Further, a reasonable assurance engagement requires the practitioner to perform tests of control and substantive tests of detail. These are generally not required in a limited assurance engagement. The third major difference between a reasonable and limited assurance engagement is the type of opinion that is provided. In a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner expresses a positive form of opinion, while in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner would express a negative opinion. For example, a positive audit opinion explicitly states that the financials are fairly presented. It states, "In our opinion, the financial report presents fairly the financial position of the entity as at the entity's financial year end." In a limited assurance engagement, such as a review, the opinion would be stated in a negative manner. For example, it would state that nothing has come to our attention that causes us to believe that the financial statements are not fairly presented. To recap, there are two major types of assurance engagements: namely reasonable and limited assurance. The major differences between these relate to the level of assurance, the required work effort, and the type of opinion that can be obtained from each engagement.